What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. If this video here on a Saturday gets to 1,000 likes next week, I will give away a special Christmas cash prize to someone in the comment section. So the more you like, the more you comment, the more you get yourself involved in the conversation, the better chance you have to win. That doesn't mean spam the comment section, but make your presence felt. Leave us a comment. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living on a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit-down video. As always, we are presented by Barstool Sports. And if you want more great crime content, check out my podcast, Out Weekly, The Sit-Down, wherever you get your podcasts. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And I'm asked all the time, when it comes to the world of the American mafia, who are the most underrated? Who are the sleepers? Who are the guys that we don't talk about enough? And we've done that a lot on this channel. We've talked about people like Joe Watts, John Franzese, Ali Shades Malangone, all sorts of guys. But there's one that I always respond with when I'm asked that question. It's none other than Jimmy Brown Failla. Jimmy Brown Failla, in my estimation, is one of the greatest earners in the history of the mafia. And to be fair, should have been the boss of the Gambino crime family. The story of Jimmy Brown and his garbage empire. Next on Sit-Down Shorts. James Failla was born January 22nd, 1919, in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bensonhurst. As we know, Bensonhurst has been a haven for mafia members for years. It goes all the way back to the late 10s and early 20s. And today, the mafia still has a piece of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Benson is known to be a mob haven. Now, not a lot is known about Jimmy Brown's childhood. Generally, I try to provide a very descriptive childhood or teenage years of these individuals. One thing we would find out is that Jimmy Brown in grade school would meet someone that would really take him as a friend for years. Jimmy would meet an individual called Billy the Fox Martocchio. Now, Martocchio would remain a close confidant of Jimmy Brown his entire life and into the time when he became a Capo regime in the Gambino crime family. Now, the early 50s would prove very helpful to Jimmy Brown. Jimmy Brown was just into his 30s, and he was making his way around the world of crime. He was becoming a gambler, a bookmaker, a loan shark. And in fact, in the early 50s, Jimmy Brown would actually be arrested for bookmaking, but he would avoid prison time. He would just escape with a $25 fine. Now, the thing about Jimmy Brown, as you can see by this photo, is he was a no-nonsense guy, very stocky, definitely a formidable individual, but he was more known in his life as an earner. But that didn't mean that you couldn't just get over on Jimmy Brown. He had the ability to take care of business if he needed to. Now, James Failla would initially in his 30s move his family out to Staten Island, where he would live until his incarceration. Now, for Jimmy Brown, he would, though, continue to maintain a foothold in Brooklyn, which we'll get to. Now, during his 30s, he would meet another young member that was coming up, at least at a higher level, in the Gambino crime family. This was the years of the Mangano family and then into the short Albert Anastasia years. Now, in the late 50s, Jimmy Brown Failla would meet Carlo Gambino, and they would remain close till Carlo Gambino's death in the 70s. Now, initially, Jimmy Brown would actually act as the driver to Carlo and a bodyguard. So he would take on a pretty helpful position early on. That's a guy you want to know, especially due to the fact that, you know, in the late 70s, as we know, Albert Anastasia would be killed inside the Park Sheraton Hotel, and Carlo Gambino would take over the new named Gambino crime family. Now, during this time, it was known that Jimmy Brown will become a made member of the Gambino crime family, and he would be slotted in to the very powerful crew of Armand Tommy Rava. If you know anything about Rava, he had a vast crew in Manhattan. It would have the likes at one point of Carmine Charlie Wagons Fatico, Fat Andy Ruggiano, Jimmy Brown Failla, Mike Chiesa, and Sammy Gravano's mentor, Tato Arello. So it was a very powerful crew. But as we know, once Albert Anastasia was killed, Carlo Gambino had a problem. He would have loyalists that wanted to remain loyal to Anastasia, even though he was dead. Maybe they wanted the mantle at some point. So Gambino basically realized he had to get rid of Armand Reva, and that's exactly what happened. Eventually, Armand Reva was whacked, and his crew was divvied up between Neil Delacroce and Anthony Rizzo. Now, Jimmy Brown Failla would head to the crew of Anthony Rizzo. Several would go to Neil Delacroce. Several would go to Anthony Rizzo. Now, Jimmy Brown, by this point, was starting to make a real name for himself due to the fact that he became an adept earner very quickly. Now, as I said, in his early years, very involved with the typical mob rackets, bookmaking, loan sharking, all those sorts of things. But to truly enhance yourself as a gangster and as an earner, you've got to get into unions. You've got to take control of industry. And that's exactly what James Failla did. Jimmy Brown essentially got involved with the garbage and private hauling company rackets. Around this time in the 60s and 70s, the state of New York and really the city of New York realized that due to how many businesses and private businesses there were, they were going to start allowing private waste haulers to come in and basically create their part of the network. And this essentially would lead to the mob taking over. What Jimmy Brown Failla would do is he essentially grabbed control and controlled the price tag of pickup. He would sell routes and decide on the charge of those routes. And if you don't like it, basically you're in trouble. So in layman's terms, he would go to a business, any private business, to say, look, we're going to handle your garbage pickup. This is what it's going to cost. And I essentially can create the price tag that I want to create. By the early 70s, if you had a private business in New York City, you were paying twice the national average as much as anyone else. Now, what James Failla would also do is acted as a quasi-consigliere for garbage in New York. He would resolve disputes, and he acted as emissary between different families. What this meant were two things. He had ultimate control over multiple private hauling companies, as well as the contracts, the jobs, everything that was controlled in the garbage industry. And each family had representation. And this is where Jimmy Brown would meet multiple high-ranking people and would ultimately work with throughout his career, including people like Alphonse Ali Shades Malangone and others. Now, also what this meant is a huge amount of windfall cash. Jimmy Brown was making a ton of money. And just think of it like this. If he's making $20 million a year in garbage, half would go to the Gambino crime family and he would pocket the other 10. Throw into the fact that by this point in the early 70s, he becomes a Capo regime. And I'm going to get into some of his crew members and the kind of money they were bringing in. Not only did that flow up to the upper echelons of the family, but it also flowed up to Jimmy Brown. Jimmy Brown was a smart, cagey individual that was the true essence of what a gangster was. And we'll talk more about the kind of guy that he was. And really, to this point, had not ever been to prison. At one point, John Gotti would have a very interesting quote about James Failla. He would say at one point, quote, Jimmy Brown took control of garbage and turned it into a candy store. It's the kind of guy Jimmy Brown was. He was building a reputation, not only in his family, but throughout his family. Paul Castellano, people like that really loved Jimmy Brown. And remember, he goes back years with Carlo Gambino. So Don Carlo obviously had a good feel for the guy as well. He was becoming a very big heavyweight in Carlo's family. Now, for Jimmy Brown, I want to kind of get into some of his crew and ultimately where he did business and his home life. As I said, during the 50s, Jimmy Brown Failla would move his family to Staten Island. He would live in this very nondescript home at 275 Evergreen Avenue in Dungan Hills, Staten Island. Now, I do want to note the very large yard. It probably looks a little different than when he had it, but notice the tree line to the right of the home. That is the end of a cul-de-sac, which basically means that Jimmy Brown can see what exactly is going on in the vast kind of area near his home. No one built next to him. So it was kind of a cagey job of him to kind of, avoid the law enforcement tactics, that sort of thing. He could spot cars in the cul-de-sac, things of that nature. Very smart way to do business. Now, Jimmy Brown would do business, though, and base his operations out of the Veteran Friends Social Club in this area of Brooklyn. It was 1468 86th Street in Brooklyn. Now, at this point in the early 70s, Jimmy Brown was a full-time Capo regime in the Gambino crime family. This is what the Veteran Friends Social Club looks like today. Last I checked, it was a barbershop. Now, I do want to talk about some of the members of Jimmy Brown's crew. That crew would include many powerful people, including Anthony Tony Pepsi Cola Vita, Joe the Cat Lafort. We've done a show on him, which can be seen here. If you know anything about Joe the Cat Lafort, a huge earner. Remember who his rabbi was. Jimmy Brown. Joseph Joe Cigars Francolino, and remember that name because he would become very instrumental in the day-to-day runnings of everything down the road for Jimmy Brown. Also included in the crew was Louis Fats Astuto, Tommy Sparrow Spinelli, and Paul Lombardozzi. Now, we would find out in 1976 as well, when the books opened, Frankie DeCicco would actually be sponsored into the family by Jimmy Brown Failla. So there was a lot of connection between Frankie DeCicco and Jimmy Brown. We'll get into that in a little bit, but Frankie DeCicco, a very powerful individual as well. He was also from Bensonhurst. We would also know that down the road, Mikey Scars DeLeonardo, he was from Bensonhurst. All these guys knew each other. And I think if you ever will ask Mikey Scars, I guarantee he will tell you, again, I'm sure he knows a lot more than I do about James Failla. He actually knew the guy, but he'll tell you himself. This guy was powerful. He was respectable, and he was the cat's meow in the Gambino crime family. Things were good for Jimmy Brown Failla. He was extorting hundreds of millions of dollars a year from the city's garbage and carting industry. He was respected by everyone. Now, as we know, on December 16th, 1985, Paul Castellano and his driver and heavyweight Tommy Bellotti were killed in front of Sparks Steakhouse. We don't need to hash out that story, but there is an interesting story about who was inside that night. If you know anything about Mr. Castellano's dinner meeting that evening, he was actually going to meet James Failla. Now, we can think about in our head, right? Think of this, right? This hit's going down. We can imagine Jimmy Brown heard it outside, and I can only imagine Jimmy Brown with his cane scurrying out either the back or front of Sparks. I've always been fascinated, and I would love to know, maybe from a good question I've always had to Mikey Scars or someone like that, what exactly did Jimmy Brown do as this was going on? I mean, did he scurry out the front? Did he scurry out the back? I've always been fascinated by that. Jimmy Brown would also be not involved, but he would be very much close to another very high-profile murder. As we know, in April 1986, Frankie DeCicco would be blown up in a car bomb outside of the Veteran Friends Social Club as he visited his longtime friend, James Failla. The 80s, though, would start to wither away and not be good for James Failla. In fact, this would not be good for a lot of people because, as we know, in the late 80s, early 90s, John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frankie Lacasio would be taken off the street. Now, initially, for James Failla, this was probably, in a way, at least for him, a good thing initially. Because what this meant was James Failla was going to be pulled up to the upper echelons to run this family. Now, one thing I think we would find out about James Failla, he didn't give a shit about being boss. He didn't really care. In the end, he was making tons of money. He was very powerful. I don't really think he wanted the spotlight. That's the kind of cagey guy that he was. He knew, let those guys take the heat. I'll just sit back and count my money. Now, upon the incarceration of John Gotti, he would, as we know, establish his son, John Gotti Jr. to take over the day-to-day runnings of the family. Now, one thing we would find out about John Jr. was he was essentially told by his father that, A, you're the chief decision maker. However, you do not do anything without the respect of old people like James Failla. They want, John Sr. knew he needed people like Jimmy Brown on his side. He couldn't just make things happen without going through those guys. So Jimmy Brown had a very established role in the running of the family once John Gotti went away. Now, I did say that essentially this may have been good getting Gotti off the street, but ultimately it fell apart because, as we know, Sammy Gravano decided eventually to cooperate with the federal government. As we know, with cooperation, you have to tell everything. And that's exactly what Sammy Gravano did. Eventually, he would testify in the early 90s. And during his testimony, he would be badgered by famed U.S. prosecutor and guest of this show, John Gleason. Gleason would ask him questions about who Jimmy Brown was. And he would tell the court that, James Failla essentially ran not only the Trade Waste Association, which ran garbage in New York, but he also had major control over Local 813, which was the Teamsters, which was run by a guy called Bernard Adelstein. And that Bernard Adelstein essentially reported directly to Failla. Think about that. That's a Teamster president reporting not to anyone else, but to Jimmy Brown. That's the kind of control that people like Failla had. Gravano would also lay out the fact that he controlled the entire garbage industry for the Gambino crime family, but he would also talk about a very depraved side of Jimmy Brown Failla. At one point in the late 90s, 1989 to be exact, James Failla would find out that a member of his crew, Thomas Spinelli, may be an informant. So what he does is he goes in to speak to John Gotti. He basically tells him, hey, look, I think Sparrow's a rat. John Gotti approves the contract for Failla to have Sparrow killed. Now, as we know in the mafia, James Failla didn't kill him. He instructed other people to kill him. Gotti instructs Gravano to kind of put it in motion. Gravano testified that he went to Danny Marino and Joe Watts to essentially help him in figuring this out. Now, we would find out that the gunman was likely Louis Fats Astuto. Astuto was incredibly close to Mr. Failla, and Tommy Sparrow would be killed in 1989. This is the charge that would absolutely sink Jimmy Brown Failla. Remember, he was born in 1989. He was in his 70s, approaching 80, and he had never been to prison. In 1993, James Failla would be charged with racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder in the hit on Tommy Sparrow Spinelli. The chief witness, Sammy Gravano. James Failla would ultimately be convicted, but he would not be convicted. In 1994, James Failla would reach a plea deal. By this point, James Failla had medical problems. He had hypertension. He walked with a cane. He was overweight, had one too many pastries, which I understand James Failla always had good pastries at his offices. I probably ate too many. That'll get you. Sugar will get you. James Failla had medical problems, and he accepted a plea deal, which for him was 7 years. Not a bad gig, really. And that's the thing that these mobsters do. They don't get hit with murder, one. They just take plea deals. And the fact that they were involved in the conspiracy, they get 5, 10, 8, 7 years, do their time. The problem was James Failla had medical issues, as I said. In 1999, about 4 years into his sentence, James Failla would die at the Federal Medical Center for Prisoners in Fort Worth, Texas. He was 80 years old. Now, again, upon the incarceration of James Failla in the 94 time period, he would actually leave most of his garbage duties to one of his underlings, Joseph Francolino. Now, Francolino probably deserves his own video. He was essentially the protege, and it was widely known throughout not only the Gambino family, but other families that Francolino essentially would take over down the road. And that's exactly what happens. Francolino had a company called Duffy Waste Company. He worked in garbage. He involved himself in contracts. But by 1997, he himself would be hemmed up in an indictment and ultimately get 30 years in federal prison. Francolino eventually would get out and recently sold multiple properties in the very uppity Chelsea Village area of New York City. He made, I think, $20 million in that. I believe Francolino died in 2018. Jimmy Brown is an underrated guy. He's a sleeper. He's someone that I think would have been a great boss for the family. And you have to wonder, what would the Gambino crime family have looked like without John Gotti? It's a question that we ponder all the time. John Gotti definitely took the family a different way. And Jimmy Brown was essentially the complete opposite of John Gotti. I will leave you with some pretty interesting things about Jimmy Brown. Failla and his associates were notoriously known to be very discreet. He was very cagey and avoided being seen with certain individuals in public. Now, Jimmy Brown would use the walk and talk method, which, as we know, it provided to be very tough to, drop conversations on that. He would also avoid electronic surveillance. He did not have landline telephones. And there was a period at one point in the early 80s when the feds were bugging Paul Castellano's mansion. During that time, Jimmy Brown was involved in hundreds of hours of conversation. And during 6 months of the period, James Failla was said to have said less than 10 words during the entire logging of conversations. He was incredibly cagey. He was incredibly adept. And it was one of the reasons he stayed out of prison really his entire life. If not for health problems, James Failla would have returned to the street, probably in a retirement role, and died in his own bed. He is one of the most underrated people in the history of the mob. He'll never be mentioned with the heavyweights. He'll never be mentioned with people like John Gotti, though. In the end, Gotti couldn't carry his shoes. It was that simple. As always, enjoy this video. Do me a favor, hit that like. Let's get to 1,000 likes. I want to give money to some creator or commenter down low. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.